The scripture reading will be from Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 7. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The names of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband.
Let me begin by apologizing to Xander because that was supposed to be Ruth chapter 2, and I believe I sent the wrong chapter. But hey, you did a great job reading some hard names. You actually nailed them. So good job, Xander. Appreciate that. I got to thinking when I arrived this morning, walked in the auditorium, I started thinking what it might be like for somebody who's visiting with us the first time. And I was like, they're going to see us all wearing pink and think that we're some sort of psychotic cult that requires a certain color be worn. Just so you know, the reason so many people are wearing pink is because we have a beloved sister who is starting her treatment for breast cancer this week, and this is one way we're trying to show support for her. And so we're collectively trying to support someone going through treatment. We love Deanna and Andrew back there, so that's why we're wearing pink. We're not that crazy. We are crazy, but not that crazy. This morning, we're going to continue our study through the book of Ruth, and we're using Ruth as a catalyst for studying about love. And today, in Ruth chapter 2, if you want to go ahead and turn there, we're going to turn our attention to the introduction between the lone couple in the story. Boaz and Ruth are about to meet for the very first time. Now, we've called this series Love Story because we're focused on what we can learn about love from all of the events and all of the characters and all the situations in the book of Ruth. But let's be honest, the circumstances that get the most focus in Ruth are around this couple. So since they're going to meet for the first time in our study today, I thought maybe we could get started by me sharing with you how Sarah and I started our love story. Now, you have to go back to the year 2000. 2000, right? 2001. 2001. And that's important to know because this story is going to center around something called AOL Instant Messenger. For those of you too young to know what that is, AOL Instant Messenger was text messaging before there was text messaging. You did it on your computer. You had internet access. You download this app on your computer. Then you could text people. That's all there is to it. I don't even know if it exists anymore, but that's beside the point. In 2001, Sarah and her parents were moving to our town, to my town, to where I grew up, my hometown, and we knew that they were going to place membership at our church. They may not have known that yet, but we did. It's because Sarah had some very close relationships with some of the other young people at our church. She knew them through Bible camp and had been friends with them for years. She and I were acquainted with each other at that time. We were familiar with each other, but didn't know each other that well. I'm 3 years older than her, so there was that little bit of an age gap. And when it was known that she was moving to our town, I was working at a paint store with a fellow member of our church, another young man, who expressed interest in her, but was too afraid to approach her. So, being the great friend that I am, I volunteered to gauge her interest in him. So one day I'm at home on the computer, Instant Messenger is up, and I see her name pop up, so I message her, and we just start talking. And I bring up my friend, I ask her, I kind of allude to the fact that he's interested in her. And she, in a very polite way, makes it known that she's not necessarily interested in him. Okay. Conversation continues. She ends up asking me if I was seeing anybody, and I answered no. She asked why, and I kind of explained that, I focus on ladies in the congregation. I focused on the girls at our church. I wanted to pursue somebody of like faith. And at that point, either they were unavailable, I'd already attempted to pursue them and it didn't work out, or it was just a no-go. Then she wrote back and I said, what I need is somebody new. My options are all gone at this point. And she wrote back, her words were, I'm new. So I responded with a question. I said, is that an invitation? And she said, take it as you wish. And the rest is history. So to Papa and Grandma, this all exists because of her. She started it. Love stories are great, aren't they? But you know what I've learned is that true love stories are orchestrated by God. And when we look here in Ruth chapter 2, I want you to first see how God brought these two together. How God is the one working behind the scenes. And then after that, we're not going to focus on the couple that much. We're going to focus on Boaz. Because what Boaz does in this chapter teaches us something tremendous about love. Not love, romantic love, general agape love, love for mankind. And it's going to set us up next week to talk about this couple. So let's start by noticing a couple things here in the text of Ruth chapter 2. There are two major ways in which God worked behind the scenes in this chapter. I want to start back in Ruth chapter 1, though, because what we're going to see is that the timing of Naomi and Ruth's return to Bethlehem was no coincidence. It was providential. If you go back to Ruth chapter 1, you look at verse 22, we're told that Naomi returned and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. Now, I know you're reading that verse going, there's not a lot happening here. But what you need to understand is the significance of the fact that they returned at the beginning of the barley harvest. You see, in that culture, widowed women with no children to care for them only had one honorable way to make a living, and that was through the welfare system of Israel. Now, the primary way God orchestrated a welfare system among his people was by giving some very specific instructions on how his people could harvest their fields. In Leviticus chapter 23, verse 22, Mosaic law says this: when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. So you have a field, you have to leave an edge around it simply for the less fortunate to be able to come and get something to eat. But not only that, we can go over to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 24, verse 19. Here is another instruction that God gave regarding harvesting a field. He says, when you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to get it. It shall be for the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. In other words, if you missed a piece, you got to leave it. If that piece gets left behind, don't go back for it. That's for the less fortunate. So Naomi and Ruth have returned to Bethlehem. They are widowed and childless as a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. This is how they're going to survive. By the welfare system that God instituted among his people. But what's really interesting is that we're told they arrived at the beginning of the barley harvest. So they've arrived in time to benefit from these laws, but more importantly, barley was the first crop harvested. That means they arrived in time for the entire harvest season. They're going to be able to start getting produce to live off of as soon as the harvest begins, and they're going to be there through the entirety of it. This is providential. There's no better time for them to be returning home than right now. But not only is their timing of their return providential, so was the location of their return. The field in which Ruth gleaned was no coincidence. Look at Ruth chapter 2, and look at verse 2 and 3 in particular. Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And Naomi said to her, "Go, my daughter." So Ruth set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Now, we'll talk more about this next time, but this means that Boaz is a relative of Ruth and Naomi. That will factor in next week's study. But she just happens to come to this field of this guy named Boaz. That's not accidental. That's intentional. That's providential. The fact that Ruth ends up in Boaz's field is not just providential because of he's a relative. It's providential because Boaz is the model of generosity. During the days of Ruth, it was in the days of the judges, and we're told at the end of the book of Judges, as I've noted previously, that everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In other words, when it came to like this welfare system of helping the poor and the impoverished and the less fortunate, a lot of people didn't do it. They did what was right in their own eyes, which meant, hey, no, I want that for me. I want all of my harvest for my bank account. But not Boaz. What we're going to see is that Boaz still adheres to God's law. And while Ruth is hoping that she's going to find a man out there who still honored God's law for the poor, she finds it in Boaz. And Ruth absolutely found favor in his eyes. Not only was she granted permission to glean in Boaz's field, but Ruth chapter 2 and verse 8 tells us that Boaz specifically said to her, "Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women." In fact, as you read through chapter 2, Boaz gives Ruth unprecedented privileges in his field. Ruth was permitted to walk right behind Boaz's young women, as he alludes to at the end of verse 8. Now, why is that significant? It's significant because the young women were responsible for picking up the grain, and the fact that Ruth would be right there with them meant that she would get the first pick of anything they missed. Another privilege that she gets is that she didn't have to fear that one of Boaz's employees would disrespect her or harm her because Boaz gave strict orders for them not to touch her. In other words, Boaz had an anti-sexual harassment policy in the workplace specifically for Ruth long before that terminology ever existed. And when she got thirsty, Ruth chapter 2 and verse 9 tells us that she didn't have to walk down the road to the well and draw out water. That would cause her to lose valuable gleaning time. Instead, she was given permission to drink from one of the containers that Boaz's employees used. And that particular day, if you skip down to verse 14, you'll see that Boaz invited her to eat lunch with his workforce. She got a company-sponsored meal even though she wasn't on the payroll. And then in verse 15 through 16 of chapter 2, you find out that Boaz instructed his employees to occasionally drop a whole stalk of wheat or barley for Ruth to pick up. In those days, if you were a gleaner, you just hoped that you could pick up enough pieces of grain to make a meal for dinner that night. But Ruth was able to go home with enough for a month after her first day simply because Boaz told his employees to be generous towards her. What was Boaz doing? Was he flirting? Maybe. But I really don't think that that's what's happening. And I don't know what's happening here. Let's just switch to the podium if we haven't already. What I think, when you get to chapter 3 of Ruth, there we go, we switched. When you get to chapter 3 of Ruth, what you'll notice is that Boaz is surprised when she makes her interest in him known. So I don't think he was flirting. I don't think he was trying to win her over. No, he was trying to honor her. He was showering her with love because he knew the difficulty of her situation. So Ruth providentially ends up in the field belonging to Boaz. And Boaz, being this worthy man of God, as he is identified in verse 1 of chapter 2, shows tremendous love toward Ruth, not so that he can get something in return, but because that's who he was. And Boaz's actions in this chapter, I believe, teach us how to love other people. In particular, how to love people who are outcasts and out of place. You see, right now, Ruth, she's a foreigner. She's a Moabite. And as I mentioned before in previous lessons, the Moabites were some of the most looked down upon people of Israel because of the things that had happened in their past between the two nations. She's a foreigner. She's a widow. She's at the bottom of the social ladder. She's an outcast. And yet Boaz treats her special. I believe Boaz's treatment of Ruth teaches us that love sees. That love takes notice. That love is observant of what's going on. Did you notice that the first thing Boaz said after greeting his field supervisor? It appears in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 5. We're told that, behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." And then verse 5, Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is that?" Now, I imagine there have been other people come and do what Ruth did, work behind his employees to pick up the scraps to make a meal for the day. And I bet Boaz always noticed them. He spots Ruth. He sees Ruth. To me, that indicates that he noticed the outcasts and the out-of-place people. It would have been very easy to ignore the ragtag destitutes who would make their way to his field and pick up the scraps. But he saw them. How many people throughout your week do you come across that just get ignored by you? It's very easy to go through life and unintentionally not see people in crisis, people in need. But not for Boaz. Boaz was the opposite. He saw her. And in that way, I think Boaz is a lot like Jesus. Jesus saw people that no one else saw. Let me just give you two examples. You can go over to Matthew chapter 19. And in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus' disciples are rebuking parents for bringing their kids to see Jesus. They don't think kids are worthy of Jesus' time. But then Jesus says, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them, for such belongs the kingdom of heaven." While his disciples may not see those kids as anything worth his time, Jesus does. He sees them. Not only that, he takes them in his arms, according to Mark chapter 10, and he blesses them. And he laid his hands on them, as Matthew chapter 19, verse 14 says. Jesus saw children when children were deemed too insignificant to see Jesus. Or you can go over to Luke chapter 19. There, Jesus arrives in a town called Jericho. And in Jericho, there's this man named Zacchaeus who was a tax collector. That was like the lowest of the low occupations. Jews hated the tax collectors. But we know something else about Zacchaeus. The text says he was small in stature. That's the politically correct way of saying he was short. And because he was short, he couldn't see over other people on the streets as Jesus walked through them. And guess what? The citizens of Jericho know who Zacchaeus is, and I bet because he's a tax collector and despised by them for his occupation and his cooperation with Rome, they weren't going to move out of the way to let him have a front row seat. So that's why Zacchaeus likely had to go climb that sycamore tree just to be able to lay eyes on Jesus. And while nobody in the crowds, no citizen of Jericho, took notice of Zacchaeus, when Jesus got to that tree, we're told that he looked up and said to Zacchaeus, "Come down, for I must stay at your house today." Jesus saw Zacchaeus when everybody else didn't. Jesus saw people, the people that oftentimes we don't see. Maybe we need to become more intentional in that. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 17 says, "If anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him?" Now you can put the focus on the closing of the heart, which I believe the verse is doing, but first and foremost, you've got to see somebody in need. You've got to have the observational skills, the intentionality of looking and seeing people who are hurting, people who are in crisis, people who are destitute, people who are outcast. And Jesus intends for his people to be that kind of person, someone who's looking, someone who's intentionally aware of the needs of others so that those needs can be addressed. Are we that people? Are we fulfilling that aspect of the mission? Are we looking for people in need? When you go to downtown Atlanta and someone walks up to you and asks you for some money, you know there's a high percentage chance you're going to be taken advantage of. But does that mean you should never help? Do you see them and see that they're in need? When you're at Walmart or at a restaurant and you see a parent with a kid struggling, do you judge them? Or do you think maybe there's more to their story? Maybe they have some needs. It's very easy for us to be caught up in our own affluence, and that impact our ability to recognize that other people don't have it as well as we do. Let's be a people who look at others and see people in need, not problems in our lives. Because Boaz saw the outcast. But Boaz took it a step further. Boaz's treatment of Ruth also teaches us that love learns. I think it's important to note that the text doesn't just tell us that Boaz spotted Ruth, but that he asked about her there in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 5. Boaz asked, "Whose young woman is this?" He wants some information. He wants to know about her situation. In verse 6, the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." And this information was important. it's the reason Boaz showed extraordinary kindness and benevolence toward her. When Ruth asked him why she found favor in his eyes in verse 10, he explained in verse 11 and 12 that all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. In other words, Boaz took the time to learn Ruth's story. See, everybody has a story. And oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes, when you know somebody's story, it changes the way you look at them. I think Boaz allowed anyone to glean in his field in keeping with the expectations of generosity outlined in Mosaic law, but I think he did things for Ruth that he didn't typically do for others because he learned about her and her situation, and he wanted to help. I think, again, he's like Jesus, because throughout his ministry, Jesus listened to people and cared about their stories. In Mark chapter 9, Jesus returned from his transfiguration to find people arguing with his disciples. When he asked what they were arguing about, a father explained that he brought his demon-possessed son to Jesus, but since Jesus wasn't there, he asked Jesus' disciples to cast it out, and they weren't able to do it. In that conversation, Jesus eventually learned that the demon made the boy mute and caused what today sounds like seizures. He also learned that the boy had been suffering from that since his childhood. Most importantly, he learned that the father of this child struggled with unbelief as to whether or not Jesus could do this. Jesus learned all this as he conversed with this father. And after learning all of it, Jesus cast the demon out of that child. Jesus took the time to know the father's story, to know the child's story. And then in John chapter 5, we read about a day when Jesus was near the pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem, where a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed would lay. And they would wait because something would occasionally happen to that pool of water, and when it did, whoever got in the pool first would be healed. It was there that Jesus encountered an invalid, and he learned that that man had been in this condition for 38 years. And every time he attempted to get into the pool when the waters were stirred, someone would step in before him because he could not physically get there fast enough. And upon learning all this about the man, Jesus healed him. Now, don't misunderstand me. Jesus didn't learn about a person or a situation before every exorcism or every healing. Sometimes he just instantaneously provided relief. But it seems to me that it was part of the healing process. When it was part of the healing process, that's when Jesus took time to listen first. Jesus understood the importance of empathy, the importance of listening to people, the importance of letting them tell their story. Now, I got to tell you, as a minister, I hear a lot of stories. One of the things I am most disappointed about myself is how callous I can feel towards those who walk up to these doors and ask for help. I've been the point person for 20 years in ministry for addressing the off-the-street benevolence requests. I've heard every story. And the problem is, after you hear the stories over and over again, you become a little bit hard-hearted. And I hate that about myself. Hate it. And it's something I battle with and work on daily because I don't want to be hard-hearted to someone when I don't know their heart. Do we take the time to hear people's stories, to really listen to and comprehend their stories? Do we take the time to learn about their situation? Do we take the time to empathize with their struggles and their hurts and their needs? Because when we do, then we can figure out how we can be a blessing to them. But until we learn, we may just be a stumbling block. Boaz's treatment of Ruth in this particular scenario teaches us to love through learning. And finally, it teaches us to love through acting. I mentioned earlier all the unprecedented privileges that Boaz gave Ruth. In particular, he made sure she was nourished, he made sure she was protected, and he made sure she was successful. For Boaz, it wasn't enough simply to allow Ruth to glean on his land. Love, and not romantic love because that's not on the table yet, but general love for a person's welfare compelled him to go the extra mile with her. And it's important for us to notice that love here by Boaz was not communicated through words of feelings or sentiments. It was communicated through action. Jesus connected the dots between love and action when he said this in Luke chapter 6 and verse 35. But love your enemies and do good. Lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and evil. Notice the connection. Love your enemies and do good. Do you realize that when it comes to love, particularly agape love, this ultimate language of love in the Bible doesn't really define it. It describes it. Now you may be thinking, well, we can go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 13. We have the definition of love there. Yes. Look at verse 4 through 6. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. We refer to this as the Bible's definition of love. But what is Scripture doing? It's not defining love, it's describing love. It's telling you what love consists of. As one author said, God does not define love in terms of abstractions, attitudes, feelings, or ideology. He only describes love in action. In God's dictionary, love is a deed. I think that's why Jesus expounded on what it means to love our neighbor by telling the parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus emphasized in that parable what the Samaritan did rather than what the Samaritan thought or felt. You read that parable in Luke chapter 10, and you'll see that it focuses on the Samaritan's actions. We're told that he went to the injured man. He bound up the man's wounds. He set the man on his own animal. He brought the man to an inn. He took care of the man. Everything that is said about the Good Samaritan relates to what he did for the injured man. And at the conclusion of that parable, pay attention to the question Jesus asked. He said, which of these three, referring to the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan, who are all mentioned in the parable, which of these three proved to be a neighbor? And the answer was the one who showed him mercy. And then Jesus concluded by saying, you go and do likewise. Not go and think or go and feel likewise, but go and do likewise. True love acts. True love does. And I believe that's why Paul will associate love with what we do in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 14, where he wrote, let all that you do be done in love. And I believe that's why John gives us the following instruction in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 18. Let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. You see, when Boaz wanted to express love to the outcast, out of place Ruth, he didn't do it with words, he did it with action.
do we take seriously the Bible's call for us to bless others through acts of love? When was the last time you engaged in a loving action that blessed an out-of-place person's life? If we want to be like Jesus, if we want to just be like Boaz, then our love has to take action. See, in Ruth chapter 2, we're not examining the love between a husband and a wife. Though you can see God orchestrating the beginnings of that relationship and how he providentially brought Ruth into Boaz's proximity. What we're really seeing is Boaz's love for outcasts. Boaz's love for people in need. Boaz's love for those who are out of place. And what it does is it challenges us to love others to that same degree. But in order for us to do that, we're going to have to be observant. We're going to have to see people. And we're going to have to listen. We're going to have to start hearing their stories so that we can empathize with their situation. And most of all, we're going to have to start taking action. We're going to have to do things to bless them in their time of need. This morning, as we send our focus onto the subject of love, maybe you haven't been as loving as you should be. Maybe, like me, there are things in your life about the way you express love to others, especially those who are outcasts, that you want to improve upon. Maybe you need to improve your love story when it comes to those outside of your typical circle of influence. This morning, we want to challenge ourselves to be better at loving others. And so if you've had any need to respond to the invitation this morning, then we want to invite you to come while together we stand and sing.
I am the way, hearken the lovely call, obey, come for he loves you so. Only a step, come for he bled for you and mine. He's a same lovely Savior yet, Jesus the crucified. Casting your heavy burden down, come to the cross, the world may frown, yet he shall wear the glorious crown when he makes up his home. Only a step, Thank you, Kyle. Our closing hymn this morning will be hymn 947. 947. We appreciate you all being here this morning.